Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Patrick Crouch from the Carlton Footy Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Max Gorn, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Number 23 in my 50 most relevant players for Supercoach, AFL Fantasy and Dream Team for 2025. Lachie Whitfield. For years, he's been bringing heartbreak, but more recently, nothing but good times when you've owned Lachie Whitfield. But what will this new season hold? We're going to talk about the potential of probability and pain, or is it just good times for Lachie Whitfield? That all coming up on today's episode of the 50 Most Relevant. Joining me this time on the podcast, he's been a regular part of hopefully your audio diet in the fantasy footy community for a number of years, especially if you're drafting, whether it be an AFL Fantasy, keeper, slider, Murdoch ball, whatever you would like to draft. These guys have been covering it. We've had him on the 50 Most Relevant for, I can't even remember, probably since we've started it. From the Draft Doctors, it's Stevie Fizz. Hello, mate. How are you? Nice to see you. And Lachie Whitfield's a fascinating player to talk about for 2025.
Yeah, he's a fun player. And thanks for your warm welcome as always, mate. He was one of our big hits last year. I think we ranked him as the number 2 defender. So always happy to talk about someone you actually got right the previous year. That's fine.
It's always the best way to do it, is happy to come on and talk about the victory laps. Not so much the other ones that we inevitably all come our way. Let's talk about him. Defensive eligible, monster year for us last year. Averaged 110 plus across the formats, meaning if you want to get him in your salary cap or classic teams this coming season, you're paying for it. Whereas last year, there was some value components to him. Over $1 million in Dream Team and Fantasy, over 1.1 actually in those two formats. And he's about $2,000 skinny of a $600,000 price point for you in Supercoach. And where you got him for value in draft, well, you ain't doing that heading into 2025. Last year, a top score in Supercoach of 153. That came against the Western Bulldogs. It's not the only team that the Western Bulldogs give up points to for halfbacks and kick-in type ball movers. While it's against the Crows in Supercoach that his top score came last year, a 160. Both of them are well skinny of what he's done previously as his best ever. It's a 170 in Supercoach and a 190 in Fantasy in the same game against Carlton back in 2019. He absolutely monstered them. Steve, you mentioned how fun he is to own, and I think that's been probably the sentiment of the last 2 years because he's become so consistent, so reliable, so strong with the way Adam Kingsley has coached and now moving the ball. Like last year, he was the best player in the league for effective disposals per game, top 5 for kicks, disposals, uncontested possessions. So much of this stable Giants defensive line moves the ball through him. And even when the tags come, they feel relatively predictable. It's just been a fun, enjoyable ride if you've been on Lachie Whitfield for the last season or two.
Yeah, 100%. He's a great player to watch. Blowing him out of defense, he's a super good player. It's just awesome player, and it's the tough years were when he had the mid-only status. I think, and even when he had the mid-only status, he was still relevant.
Yeah, he's now moved into this space of being the best defender for us last year in AFL Fantasy with that 111.7 average, 18 tons, which is just wild. The conversion rate of 100 to 120 is up to 10. So again, now we're talking captaincy, vice-captaincy territories for you in your classic and in your draft team. He's the number 1 defender by points, the number 2 by average. But you look at him overall, he's 3rd for points and 5th for average. He's one of only 7 guys in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team last year to go over that 110 marker by average. And in Supercoach, 111 average, 18 tons, 7 over 120s, but 3rd for defenders for points, 4th by average, top 14 for points overall, top 16 for average overall. Across the formats, across the lines, it doesn't seem to matter. He scores, the ball plays through him, and he's such an interesting guy to talk about, Steve, because so often when it gets to the 50 most relevant, we start looking at, well, there might be some positional volatility, or there might be some natural regression, or there's this new arrival that might stump his growth. But as I've tried to look at where any scoring decline could come, I've struggled to feel like any of the arguments hold a decent volume of water to go, yeah, that pathway makes sense without really stretching it. Do you see a world where the scoring decline, not the injury history, but the scoring decline could come for Lachie Whitfield?
Well, I mean, there's pathways to that, but nothing he did really breaks the things I like to look at in terms of suggesting he declined. Like, we don't have years and years of kick-in data, but generally, if the guys who have had over 6% of their teams kick-ins, there's been a bit of a dip, but not much. So taking over 7 marks a game, pretty high. But it's not otherworldly. There's a rate, market share, whatever you want to use. That's the hip word these days of a team sort of kicks or whatever you can get, and he doesn't quite break it. So again, he's at the very limit of what I think's repeatable. So I think it's really important to just remember when you got something right, it's not necessarily because it was a great pick. It was like everything went right for him. Right? They got the ball pumped inside 50 against them, like just relentlessly. They should have been a terrible team, right? But they've got that brick wall. And some of the astute people on Twitter have pointed out to me the conversion rate of teams was pretty poor. So maybe he loses kick-ins that way. But, again, what are you talking there? Maybe two kicks a week? So
yeah, well, you're talking...
There's certainly a pathway.
Yeah, it's definitely there. There's some thought that the departures of a couple of free agents with an Isaac Cumming and a Harry Perryman have both spent some time coming more wing and a little bit of halfback. Perryman's kind of been your modern-day utility of wherever he's needed to go there. But there's been nothing really... You mentioned this solid back six of the Giants. Even with a Lachie Ash in the side, who's got some components of comparable skill set to Whitfield, it doesn't feel like, barring that conversion rate and teams changing the way they bring the ball inside the Giants 50, it doesn't feel like too much is going to change around how they structure up that defensive ball movement.
No, you wouldn't suspect so. I mean, someone's obviously going to have to replace Perryman, but it's really the same faces back there. It'll be Himmelberg, Taylor, Iden, and Buckley. So, yeah, I can't see heaps changing from a personnel point of view.
No, neither can I. Probably the biggest, most water-holding reason to not go near Lachie Whitfield historically has been that the boy is made of papier-mâché, that he finds a way to get himself hurt, suspended, injured. There's concussions, then there's club-imposed suspensions, then there's a back injury here, there's a concussion over there. There's something wrong with it's a different type of injury history than others throughout that we've talked in the 50 most relevant, or others that we might consider. How do you view a player's injury history that feels really broad, of so many different dynamics to that injury-prone narrative, as opposed to someone, just for sake of contrast, an Adam Chera, who's seemingly almost all soft tissue related? How do you treat the injury-prone narrative, which again hasn't been true the last 2 years, but how do you treat a scattered gun approach as opposed to a narrow, similar view? Does it change for you in how you rate a player?
It may. It's kind of an interesting one. You bring up interesting points there. Adam Chera, continual soft tissues. We've seen that with players, and it repeats, especially later in the career. Lachie Whitfield's kind of had some, like you mentioned, some weird ones. But then you've got the other end of the spectrum, like, say, a Hunter Clark. Well, I don't know that a player like that is maybe protecting himself the right way, because he seemed to get a lot of collision injuries. So, obviously I'm ranking my players, and someone who's safer and someone who's maybe volatile with their injury history, they can be in the same tier, and it might just be the way I'm building my squad. I'll take a little bit of a risk if I need to create some upside for my team, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, it's true. one of the challenges around starting Lachie Whitfield in the classic territory. So we're definitely going to take you off brand for a half moment there, which we know if you listen to the Draft Doctors podcast, you can absolutely get Stevie Fizz through there by using the word ADP and then insert your question, not price point. That's how you get your question answered to him from a salary cap perspective. But it's interesting because last year we had those early season buys. They're back again. They're scattered and spaced differently. But there was a narrative that came from the community, which again was we'd never done it before, was you probably can't start guys that are at the upper ends of the price point that have an early buy. Now, the winner of AFL Fantasy probably put that on his head a little bit because he started Tom Green, went out of the gate, just knocked it out of the park, gets to the buy, moves to Zorko, and those moves just worked beautifully for him and one of the many things he did right last year to win AFL Fantasy. They do have an awkward buy. The Giants again this year, round 2 for super coaches. He won't have even moved his price. For AFL Fantasy, you'll have had that kind of double price movement sitting through there. What's your take on premiums at the upper end and an early season buy? I know in draft it's a bit different, which we'll come to, but in classic formats, does that scare you off starting a player or doesn't change too much for you?
It's a good question, man. I probably wouldn't be scared, but I guess listening to other podcasts this year and how people who were successful navigated the buys, it sort of came across that there was no one perfect answer. So you can kind of do what you want, that's great. That's fantastic that multiple strategies is great. Where Whitfield might struggle is he's obviously at the top of his price point, and it feels to me at least that some of the guys who maybe will outperform their average, and I'll say it that way rather than outperform their price, have the buy as well. Like say Callum Mills, he'll have the buy. To me, he's a smash to outperform his pick. I project him straight into that midfield. I know there's a lot of skeptics out there, but I'm all on board. Maybe you see Dan Rioli as being a value pick. Kitty Coleman, I know a lot of people on. So I guess you can't go too crazy. I'm assuming in your salary cap model. So I feel like that's where it hurts Whitfield and probably steers him towards maybe. I know Jack Sinclair's been mentioned a lot, and Harry Shees, or maybe it steers them in towards those sort of players if they're looking to pay up.
It's the risk profile of how we build our salary cap side, isn't it? It's the positional volatility. It's the early season buys. It's the level of injury history that we've got that often provides that value. You mentioned a Callum Mills as this value guy. Well, he's got there more through injuries, more so than anything else that's seen this upside element that we're now forecasting to come. When I look at this early fixture run for the Giants too, there doesn't feel like that tag's coming too, because that's probably the thing that scared people off him. I know James Jordan got a hold of him once last year in another game. It wasn't really that big of an impact, but it's Collingwood in opening round, which again doesn't change his scores for us, but affects the price movement. Then it's Melbourne at the MCG. They head off on their bye. Then the Hawks, the Eagles, which could be really favourable, St Kilda, Adelaide, the Bulldogs, and then by the time they get to round 8, that's where the potential James Jordan tag comes again. Whether or not Dean Cox chooses to run one or not, we'll wait and see. But that fixture is okay, but I'm curious on your thought around this. We look at 2024 data as the only information we have of scoring in the last 10, scoring in the last 5, and we choose that narrative to go, well, they gave that away last year, they'll do it again. Are there any teams that you feel confident that you could basically copy and paste the scoring trends against from 2024 and bring it into 2025? Or is it just completely, we can't use scoring data from last year, at least until we get some new sets this year?
No, it's a really great question, MJ, and I've seen this debated on the socials. I still feel like, Richmond will probably be good for mid. It's probably going to be good for a lot of players, really. But Melbourne, I feel historically has been really good for defenders because, again, like GWS, Melbourne will put the ball inside 50 frequently, but their forward line's kind of poor at converting. Gold Coast, probably similar. They'll get the ball inside 50 a lot, won't be able to convert it. And although I think maybe Gold Coast pressure a little bit better, but again, there should be some points in those matchups for defenders. I mean, Rucks against Geelong, it's been like good 10 years we've been running that matchup. So, yeah, I think unless there's been some significant personnel changes or maybe, like West Coast have got to change a coach, and maybe there's a different way to approach it. But I feel like there's going to be some that carry over.
Yeah, it's true. Knowing who they are and what they are, that's the beauty of that first kind of 6 to 8 weeks of the season, how it runs. Look, from a salary cap and a classic perspective, of all the defenders that you go, should they have some variable change around them? It's minimal, if anything at all. That I don't see a pathway to that kick-in changing. The injury history has now held for 2 years, and as random and the game of hospital randomizer, it feels like it's kind of holding. If you choose not to start him because you turned off by the early bye, you don't want to add that risk profile into your starting squad, totally get it. But is he somebody that you want to have in your team by the mid-season bye block? Absolutely. Injury to me is the pathway that prevents him from being one of the top-line defenders this year. And whether you choose to start him or choose to upgrade him, the conversation isn't, is Lachie Whitfield relevant? The question really is, when do you get your hands on Lachie Whitfield? And Steve, it's probably that same sort of question on draft day. We know how many teams you have is a variable, how many on field is a variable. I'll ask you two questions. One, where does he sit for you in your ranks? And then I'll ask you a second question about when to get him in a second. But where does he sit in your tiers of defender ranking?
Yeah, I actually just moved him today from number 1 down to number 2. So I'm all on board completely.
Yeah, and as you should be too. So people will pick Sheasel first. Some will pick Whitfield first. Others might really reach for a Sinclair, just trying to play it safe. I'm not sure he'd be the number 1 defender off the board for me, but I'd at least get it. Some might think the Zorko train continues on again, despite Kitty Coleman. But where do we start looking at these defenders early on? Because it's not just about, okay, he's the first or second defender off the board, I think is safe to say. But where do we take these kind of top 3 rucks, another year of low top-end forwards, and then just this scattergun of M1 to M15 could be absolutely anybody in that range. So how do we choose to approach drafting someone like a Whitfield and a top-line defender on draft day?
And this is just my opinion, and you made the absolute correct point that league size is going to dictate where he goes. So in a shallower league, like if you're doing a 3-4-1-3 with 10 teams, I think he could go as early as pick 5. And I mean, he could be the first defender off the board. But in a 5-7-1-5, 10 teams, or maybe it's the shallower on-field format, but you got 14 teams. I still feel like you want to build out your midfield a little bit, so I'd be looking at him in round 2. Say you've gone, if you're at the back end of round 2 and you've taken Zach Merritt, he'd be a great person to double back with. I always feel like you want to get a good defender. Yeah, you don't want to get stuck with hoping a McKercher pops or hoping a Rivers stays in the mid or hoping this guy inherits the percentage of kick-in share. Like, it's a bit easier to stream that kind of forward of the ball. If you miss a top-line defender, it does feel like you're going to miss out a bit on draft day. Yeah, 100%. Like, they just have so much access to points, the guys who were the distributors off halfback. We've seen that over the last, 7 years or whatever. It's really swung in their favour, and the gap between the top and, the 50th is enormous. So, yeah, I always feel like you want to leave your draft with 1, ideally 2, and then you can look at your McKercher's probably a little bit different in that he's got a bit of heat, but those guys as your D3, and if they elevate, that's just fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. If you haven't checked out the Draft Doctors podcast yet, it drops every single Wednesday morning during the preseason. It's there to check out for your commute. They've just wrapped up their rankings season, so sort of top 25, top 30 across the lines for AFL Fantasy, Dream Team, and for Keeper rankings. They've put that all in there for you to go and check out. But Steve, I believe the draft kit is, if it's not just out yet, it's days away. What can we expect from the draft kit from the draft doctors in 2025?
Just every rank will be perfect. We won't get anything wrong. There'll be quality analysis, no spelling errors. No, it's a great kit. We profile 15 players from each team who we think are most draft relevant. Sometimes it's easy to find the 15 and you wish you only had 10, and sometimes, not often, you could probably use 18. We got all our ranks. We got the keepers in there. I'm pretty sure Stato's done his best 22 under 22, which I know is really popular. And the boys are, Matty Fizz, one of the best writers out there, always making us laugh. So, yeah, it's just a good resource, and hopefully it'll be out by this show does.
Look, if it is, we'll put it in the description of this episode. If not, we'll put the Draft Doctors website in the description of this episode too, so that when it is out, we'll be sure to share it on social media and make you know. If you're a draft player, again, whether you choose to draft on Supercoach, on the AFL Fantasy platform, the Keeper platform, the Slider platform, it is a great time to be a draft coach with so many options available for you to choose what's right for your league, what level of customizations you like, how you want it to function. Do you like just a jacket of a club? Do you like the player's head? There's just choice now, which is just so good. It's been a long time in the draft community since we've actually had a chance to choose what we wanted and how we needed it to work. So it's fantastic for the draft coaches. Hey, mate, always love every chance we get every preseason to touch base with you. The Draft Doctor is one of my favorite podcasts, and always a pleasure to talk to you, mate.
It's always fun to be here. You always do a great job. It's a great series. I don't know how you talk about one player for 20 minutes. My head would explode, but you do an amazing job, mate.
I have no idea how. I think we did one the other day. It was like 38 minutes, and I legitimately cried on the inside, going, "How do we do that?" And then you realise, maybe Max Gorn doesn't need a 39-minute podcast, but we'll figure that all out. We'll see how you go. Hey, if you're enjoying this series of the 50 most relevant, wherever you're checking this episode out, the good news is there is episodes, just weeks worth of content for you to go to check out. If you're watching this on YouTube, it's nice to see a comment below. Let us know what you think Lachie's going to average in 2025. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, make sure you do so. And the audio podcast is over there as well. Wherever you're listening to this, we are there with all the other episodes. Wherever you get your audio podcasts, Coaches Panel are there. Subscribe to the channel. Give it a 5-star rating if you're enjoying this preseason series so far. And in the description of this episode, you get that draft kit link if it's out. If not, still all the details to get in touch with Steve and the Draft Doctors are there, where you can join our Patreon, get access to our merch line, and all the Coaches Panel social media is there as well. That is the place to go check it out. You ready for a clue to who's at the number? Richie Benno? Yep, number 22. I haven't given you a clue like this, so let's give you one. I'm talking about an Adelaide Crow. There you go. So that narrows it down to 3 players that are relevant? I'm joking. They're my team. It's fine. But here's what I'll say. There is one player that if this one player doesn't play, this guy could be top of his line. It just takes one variable to make this guy the best option possible for you. Just one thing changes everything for another Adelaide Crow. Who am I talking about? What has to go his way? You'll find out tomorrow in the 50 Most Relevant.